Hey, welcome back to the eDrum Workshop, I'm Luke. Today I'm taking a look at drum-tec's GrooveDot triggers, a compact side trigger that can be installed inside a number of different drum pads. I was sent two of these alongside two groove bar triggers, some real feel mesh heads and a bass drum patch. If you want to know what I thought of the groove bar triggers, I have a detailed video review that I've linked in the description. And as always, full disclosure, yes, drum-tec sent these to me, but this is a review video with pros and cons from my experience with the triggers, and there's no input from drum-tec themselves. The GrooveDot is the cheaper and simpler of drum-tec's trigger solutions, and it comes in two versions. A dual zone trigger intended for toms or snare drums, and a single zone trigger intended for kick drums. They come in a nicely presented box which contains the trigger itself, a bag of parts, and a slip with a QR code that takes you to a digital manual. For the dual zone option, the parts include two jack connectors of different lengths, whereas the single zone trigger comes with just the longer connector. Alongside these, you also get a plastic clip and a small wrench for installation. As with the groove bars, I think it would have been helpful to have the model printed on the box. I received one of each to install in a tom pad and a kick drum, and I wasn't really sure which one was which until I double checked the website. It's not a big deal, but clarity is nice. The build of the trigger is simple and effective. The housing is plastic and the trigger foam is placed on top with a piezo underneath for the head trigger, and the rim piezo is contained within the casing on the dual zone version. The output jack of the trigger is a 3.5mm or 1/8 inch jack socket which you attach to the provided cable extender. The plastic housing is then attached to a metal mount which you use to connect the trigger to the lug screws of your drum. The dual zone version is the shorter of the two, and it's designed to fit in drums from 4 inches deep. The single zone version is longer to accommodate the larger spacing on most kick drums. Just like with the groove bar triggers, the slot in the mounts of these triggers is actually too narrow to accommodate some sizes of lug screws. They can take M4 or 4mm screws, but M5 or 5mm screws won't fit through the slot. There isn't really much standardization of lug screw sizes, and imperial sizes might also differ, so unfortunately this might cause issues for some people. On the flip side, this is a detachable part, so hopefully drum-tec will increase the sizes of these slots in the future. The mounting slots have been designed to try to accommodate different screw spacings, but I actually ran into an issue with this. All of my tom pads are actually converted snare drums, and the first drum that I installed the GrooveDot to was a 12x5 inch snare. Unfortunately, the lug screw spacing of this drum was almost the exact length of the mount. When I fitted it with all 4 screws inside the slot, the trigger couldn't touch the head at all. The only way to raise it was to try and skip a screw. This meant I had to go too high instead, which then went on to affect the performance, which I'll come back to. So I ended up swapping it out into a different drum. Now fortunately for me that was an option, but it might not be for everybody. I'm not really sure though if there's a perfect solution to this. If they made the brackets any longer, that will increase the depth of the shell that they'll fit into. Also, whether they make them longer or shorter, there's a chance that this will just cause the same problem on a different hole spacing pattern. The only other solution I can think of is including a second bracket of a different length, but I would imagine that this would bring up the price a bit due to adding materials. Now moving on to the kick drum, I already have a DIY trigger and foam setup inside my drum that I didn't want to remove to install this trigger. Unfortunately, the GrooveDot wouldn't fit in alongside my own parts. The drum does have a hardware mount attached quite close to the rim, so I thought, aha, I can attach the trigger to the screws of this mount. Nope. Unlike the lug screws, this mount is fitted with M5 screws, so I couldn't attach this trigger to it. So perfectly screwed over. I swapped to a different 18-inch kick drum instead, and everything went incredibly smoothly. Getting the trigger height right was easy with the longer mounting slot, and there's a great visual guide in the manual for the recommended placement. Once the trigger is mounted, you can attach the 1/8 to 1/4 inch jack extension cable to the trigger by threading the mini jack through the vent hole, then attach the large jack socket to a lug of your drum using the provided clip. I quite like this solution because it's non-destructive, and the mini jack connectors make things much more flexible than hardwired cables. So the design is simple, and mounting is generally easy unless you happen to have the exact wrong combination of hole spacing and screw sizes, but the important thing is the performance. Starting with the single zone kick trigger on my 18-inch drum, it's good news all round. This trigger is really sensitive, which is great for picking up the full range of my dynamics. So overall, I've had fantastic results with it, and I would happily carry on using the GrooveDot as a kick trigger. Moving on to the dual zone trigger, as I mentioned earlier, the trigger height was set up badly on the first drum that I installed it in due to the lug hole spacing. I could feel the foam pushing right up against the mesh head, and it was creating a pretty obvious bulge. When I came to play it, it was very sensitive on the head and rim, but I was getting a really obvious drop off in sensitivity as I moved to the side of the head directly opposite the trigger. But I had a feeling that this was down to the trigger height, so this is where I swapped it into another drum. The response was so much better now as suspected, so definitely pay attention to the foam height when you're installing this trigger. If you want to use this with a module that has a cross stick mode, one thing to keep in mind is that your cross sticks will likely be lower in velocity than just hitting the rim. So to give this a bit of a boost, I'd recommend placing the trigger closer to the area that your stick will hit the rim if you're able to. Moving on to specific modules, the Roland TD-50X and TD-27 gave me the exact same results. Positional sensing on the head doesn't work because this is a side trigger, however I can get the rim positional sensing to work with the PDA-100, PDA-120 or PDA-140F presets. The rim shots were only really consistent on harder hits, but it did a good enough job if you do want to use this feature. If you're not bothered about this feature or you're using a Roland module like the TD-17 that doesn't have positional sensing, using a side trigger preset like the PDX-12, PDX-8 or Pad 2 settings work great for just the head and rim zones. I wouldn't personally recommend this trigger for a snare drum on the TD-50X or TD-27 because there are better options available for those modules. On the Pearl Mimic Pro module, I set things up with the side trigger preset and dialed in the settings to my playing style. Using the correct rim shot threshold settings, I could get 3 articulations from the drum. There were no surprises at all with the Mimic, it performed exactly as I expected, which was really well. On the 2-box DrumIt 5 Mark II module, I also got great results. As with any triggers on this module, getting the balance of rim settings right is important for good head-rim separation, but once these were set up, both available zones played great. On the Alesis Strike module, things were surprising. I'm used to the Strike struggling with the rim zone of third-party triggers, including drum-tec's GrooveBar trigger. However, when I plugged in the GrooveDot as a tom pad, I noticed that I was getting a different response right away. After playing with the settings for some time, it performed really well. This is the best rim response I've got out of any third-party trigger that I've tried with the Strike. So I was ready to say, if you want to convert drums for use with the Strike module, the GrooveDots are great. But then I plugged it into the snare input and dialed in the exact same settings so that I could shoot some examples of that, and this is where I discovered that each input on the Strike module triggers differently regardless of their settings. No matter what settings I adjusted, I couldn't get the GrooveDot to trigger the same on the snare input as it did on the Tom 1 or Tom 2 inputs. I then tried the Tom 4 input, which uses the same size pad as the snare drum on the Strike Pro kit, and the rim triggering was shaky like the snare input. So I tried all of the drum inputs, and this is what I can say. You can probably get good results from the GrooveDot with the Strike module on a 12-inch or smaller drum in the Tom 1 or Tom 2 inputs with the right settings. If you use it in any other inputs and possibly in any other drum, it might not work correctly. This is entirely down to the Strike module, not these triggers. Performance on my eDRUMin 10 trigger module was great, as expected. As usual, dialing in the right settings is crucial, but once set up, I could achieve a good head, rim and rim shot response. After these great results with my 12-inch drum, I felt that I really had to see if the mild drop-off would get worse on a larger drum, so I installed it into my 14-inch pad. Near the trigger and in the centre, things are still good, but moving to the opposite edge of the head, the signal did become obviously weaker. It is possible to compensate for this a bit with velocity curves, and some people might be happy with this, in which case you can still get all articulations. Personally though, I think that the GrooveDots are better suited to smaller drums, and a trigger like the Groove Bar would probably be better if you wanted to go larger. Overall though, the GrooveDots are great triggers that will suit the majority of people, and they only have a few small downsides in specific situations, so the only other thing for me is the price. The single zone is currently €89 and the dual zone is €99. For a side trigger, this is reasonably expensive and there are cheaper options around. However, I do think that the performance of these triggers speaks for itself, and the nice design features definitely raise the value. So if you're happy to pay this price for this performance and convenience, then I think these triggers are definitely worth your time. If you want to see what I think of other drum triggers, just click here, sit back and relax. If you enjoyed any of the kits that you've heard in this video, check out my store at the eDrumworkshop.com. Enjoy the rest of your day and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!